Hi everybody, in today's video we're going to add particle effects and improved fog effects to our game, including these little poppy particle sparks to our little torches. So if you want to learn how to do that, then stay tuned. Hi, my name is Michael. Join me as we build an epic Metroidvania game in Godot 4 using GD script. This is the Metroidvania Forge. Okay, so as we work on adding these new effects to our levels here, we're not going to need to bring in any new textures or anything like that. We're going to be working exclusively with built-in Godot features. And the first item that we're going to approach will be our fog. And what we're going to do is kind of replace some of the fog elements that we've done, or at least add new elements that have a texture to them and a scroll speed. This isn't going to be too revolutionary, although we are going to work with a visual shader so that we can create a fade effect for our fog so that we can have it fade off. Now you could do this with a texture, but this is a fun way to introduce visual shaders in Godot. And then what we'll be doing after that is we'll look at two different ways that we can use Godot's particle system. One to create sparks on our torches, and the second one will be to be able to create floating orbs and spots in the environment here in this first level. Okay, so let's start here on my level 1 scene and let's add this new fog. And the first thing I want to do is actually I want to maybe take some of this parallax stuff and just drop it in a new node. So I'm going to make a new tile node that I'm just going to call something like parallax layers. I think first thing I'll do though is organize this a little bit. So I'm going to add a new node here, just a node 2D. And I'm going to call this node my parallax layers. And this way I'll be able to keep things organized a little bit, okay? Because right now I've just got a whole lot going on and it's getting a little bit hard to manage and work with this scene tree. So if I just drag these layers here, you can see that now I've got, in fact, I'm going to call this background parallax layers. I've got all of these layers grouped. I can turn them off and on together if I need to, and I can collapse it. And that's just going to help clean up the scene tree. Now this fog layer probably belongs in here as well. And let's see. Then after that, we've got our props, which I think is fine where it is. And then we've got some tile maps. I'll probably keep these, but you know, it wouldn't hurt to add a node for that. So if we add this node here and we just call it like our level tile maps or something like that. I'm really just using these nodes like folders, right? To keep things organized. Because it's not going to affect them. I could move this node and all of the children will move with it. And that kind of points out that I've got props are not with the level tile maps, but that's okay. And then aside from that, I've got some foreground elements here. So maybe what we do is we group these as well. We have two things of props, don't we? We've got props up here, and we've got props back here. I'm going to take these props, put them in the background. And I'm going to take these props and put them in the level. And then let's make one more node. And I'm going to take all of these foreground parallaxing elements and drop them in there. Okay, I'm feeling a lot better about how this is all organized now because everything's kind of grouped together. And in fact, maybe these player and these other things belong at a higher level in the hierarchy because they're, I don't know, you pick whatever, top or bottom, just keep things together. So this new fog layer that we're going to create, we could create it as part of the background or we could create it as part of the foreground. And in this scene right here, I'm not going to replace this fog. Although the technique that we're going to use, you may want to use it to replace this fog layer as well, because it's going to be basically a more interesting looking version of the fog layer. But what I like about this particular fog layer is it's just uniform, just to give a fade out of the whole background section. And then the fog layer that we're going to be adding today, like I mentioned, is going to be animated and it's going to have a bit of a texture. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to create a new sprite 2D to get started. And call this our fog sprite. This sprite, its texture, we're going to make a new texture and it's going to be this noise texture 2D. So we've got some really awesome noise textures and texture tools built into Godot that can be really useful, especially for creating shaders. We are going to use a shader. We're not going to use a noise in the shader, but for those of you who are kind of more familiar with shaders, you might get a sense of how this can work. But this noise texture, once we create it, we do need to provide it some configuration. And one thing that we absolutely need is this noise right here. We need something to control the noise property. And there's a fast noise light resource that we can add. And once we add that, it's going to create this noise texture, right? And it's got a few things like frequency that we can control how frequent that noise is, or in other words, how large or small it will be. There's also some other settings here that we don't need to use a whole lot, like, so these are a little bit more advanced, and so you guys can play around with these or maybe even learn about them if you want to. But for our purposes and for getting started, we're just going to keep it pretty straightforward. I am going to turn on this seamless option, which is going to make it so that it tiles seamlessly. And then I'm going to turn off normalize. You can turn this on or off. Normalize will have a higher contrast version of the noise with darker blacks and more whites. Turning that off will be a little bit more uniform like this. So you can just toggle that to get the feel that you want. Then a couple other options. Obviously, there's an invert. There's an in 3D space. I don't know a whole lot about the differences about calculating it in 3D space versus 2D. So if anybody does, go ahead and drop that in the comments. And then this as normal map, if we turn that on, if you're familiar with normal maps, you can render this noise out into a normal map form. So if you need it to light stuff, then that's pretty useful. But of course, we don't need that, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave it as is. Now, this seamless blend, if we turn it all the way down, you can see the seams are pretty harsh. This controls essentially how big of a blend you have there. You'll notice as I get further towards 1, it's less noticeable, but to some degree, it almost gets noticeable again. So somewhere around 0.5 is usually pretty good for me, or even smaller, depending on the size of your texture. Okay, so we've got this configured. Another thing we can do with our noise textures, we can add a color ramp. Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and create a new gradient for the color ramp. And right now with black and white, obviously it's already black and white, but you can see how we can map colors on here. And what we want to do essentially is pick our primary color, which I'm going to leave as white because we'll use Modulate to color this as well. And then what we can do is take this other piece of the color ramp, and let's say we made this white but turned the alpha all the way down. Well, now we've got a different style of noise texture, right? Because instead of having black and white, we now have white with transparency. Now you could also tinge the color of your fog a little bit by adding a bit of a color to this alpha channel. And then you may want to drag these stops around to control how harsh that effect is. I'm not going to keep a whole lot of that, but I think I will keep a tiny bit of a bluer color as it fades out, something like that. So that's what my texture is looking like now that we've added the noise and the color ramp. Now we're going to have to refine this a little bit. I think the next step is I want to add this to a parallaxing layer because I want it to maintain that depth effect I've got going on in my level. So let's go ahead and add that. And we'll go ahead and call this our fog parallax as well, just to help name. And the more you name and keep your naming and your organization of your nodes consistent, the easier it's going to be to work on these levels as they get complex. So we've got this fog parallax 2D layer, and I'm going to do some of the things that I've done in the past. I don't really want this to move up and down with the level a whole lot. Although for fun, let's add just a little bit of that. I'm going to go ahead and set the X a little bit higher because it's going to be a foreground element, kind of like these. I'm going to set it to 1.3, which is going to make it just behind some of my faster moving parallax elements. 1.2, oh, well, let's see, 1.2, 1.1. See, I need to name these. These are my lights. So these are light stream. I'm going to reorganize these, the order of them. And then we've got our foreground layers, our 1.4 and 1.6. So by setting this one to 1.3, it's going to parallax just in between the lights and the foreground elements. Another thing that we can do that's really fun, because we've got this texture and it's kind of ugly, we're going to have to refine how it looks. Before we refine the visuals of it, we can use this parallax layer to repeat it. And this is a setting we haven't used before, but there's this repeat section. Now the repeat size will control how often it repeats, right? And the repeat size should be based on essentially the guts or the internals of what we want to repeat. Because this texture is 512 by 512 pixels, we want our repeat size on the X to be 512, right? Which, as you can see, repeats that. And because we have a seamless noise texture, you can't even tell where the two transition, which is really nice. Clearly, if we look at this, 2 is big enough to cover our screen resolution. I can't even see it. Do I have it off? I do. Let's see. Let's show viewport. Bloop, bloop. Okay, so you can see right here the purple box, right? That's our screen size. And this guy is big enough that if we set the repeating up correctly, it'll always cover that. And I think what we want to do is maybe increase the repeat times. If we look at this, it says overrides the amount of times the texture repeats. Each texture copy spreads evenly from the origin by the repeat size, which is what we just configured up here. Useful for when zooming out with the camera. Let's just go ahead maybe and actually just test this scene and see what happens with this white layer that we've got. Okay, you can see it's not quite working because it's probably repeating, but we need to set it so that it repeats sooner, right? Because it's not repeating until we get far enough out. Boink, there we go. Now it's repeating, and we might see that again. Yeah. If we increase this repeat times to 2, now you can see it's spanning a larger area. And then if we go back, well, actually, that's probably good, but maybe what we need to do instead is take our fog sprite and drag it over. Maybe that's really what we need to. But then by having it repeat twice, it's going to be on the left and the right, essentially. Let's save that. There we go. That's looking better. Okay, so now this is going to repeat indefinitely. We have a layering issue, of course, because we've got a parallax layer that needs to be above the player, but maybe behind these. So let's go ahead and look at the ordering. We've got, I think I put the z-index on the sprites themselves, 4, which that's okay. I actually kind of prefer putting it on a parent element. That's z-index is 0. What do I got on this one? Okay, yeah, so you can see these ones, I put it up on the parallax layer. That's a 10. So in order to get this, if we wanted it in front of the lights, then it would have to be higher than 4, I think is what we had it at, right? So let's go ahead and just mess around with the z-index of this. Ordering z-index, set it to maybe 5. Now it's in front of the player, and it's in front of those light streams. I'm also going to drag my sprite down so that it's not showing at the bottom there. And we'll be adjusting this, but this is just to kind of get a sense. That didn't seem to update. Let's go ahead and close. Some of these changes might need to rerun the game to be able to see them. No. Is something, this might be what I've done before where I try and position this, but maybe I'm actually setting an offset or something like that. Oh no, I still have it poking up there, don't I? Let's drag it all the way down. Did that not save? I swear I just did this. I'm going crazy. There we go. Okay, now it's covering. It's in front of the player. It's got its own parallax scale. I want to change one other setting though, because since this is a fog, I want it to be drifting through the level and through the scene. So when we look at our parallax 2D node, in addition to the repeat, we've got auto scroll. And you could use X and Y. So if I were to put 100 on the Y, save that and go back, you can see it's automatically scrolling, which because we don't have a repeat on the Y, that looks goofy, right? And you could make it repeat on the Y. That's not going to work good with what we're going to do in our next step. So I'm going to just repeat it on the X. And I'm going to pick a value. Let's pick something like 25 and see how that looks. And because that scrolled off, I'm going to need to restart the game, I think. There we go. I think I want it to scroll negatively though. So let's go negative 25. And voila. So now we've got a fog layer that's moving on its own and it's parallaxing. So we're kind of combining those two effects to get, you know, a more complex movement of the fog layer. This works generally. The fog is pretty ugly. So there's two things we can do to improve how this looks. One simple thing would just be to change the color. You could change the color ramp if you want to. I like how I've got it set up because I want to reuse this a little bit. We could come in here and we can modulate it. So maybe you want to pick a color that fits the general fog that we've already got set up in this scene. And of course you can drag the alpha down so that it's a lot more subtle, right? So if we were to run the game with this, it's not going to be super noticeable, but it is there. It's a noticeable element. It's got movement and it adds depth to the scene. Now, the other thing is I don't really want my fog to go all the way to the top of the level. Okay. Now, like I mentioned previously, we could create a texture that fades out and we could use that texture. And typically that's probably the route that I would go. But because we're using these procedural textures and other things in Godot, I want to introduce how to create your own material and visual shader that we can use to fade this out. Now, because I want to reuse this shader and material in other places, before we start making it, I want to set up a spot in my resources where I can save these. So I'm going to create a new folder here. And we'll just call this folder maybe materials and shaders. So we've got a spot for it. Typically, you might want to have subfolders to organize those. Again, simple game. We're not going to have a lot of materials and shaders, so I'll probably just dump them in here. Now we could go ahead and create a new resource, and we could start creating those materials and those shaders and things like that. If we come in here, we could say there's a new canvas item material. Alternatively, we could select this fog sprite that we want to apply the material to, and we could start by creating a new material here. So either way works, so long as we save it if we do it this method, right? If we don't save it, if we create it directly on the object and don't save it, then it's going to only exist on this instance. You won't be able to reuse it. So I'm going to come in here, and what we want is a shader material because we're going to apply a custom shader to it. So once we expand this, we can go in here. In fact, let's do this real quick. Let's save as. And I'm going to just navigate up to my materials and shaders folder. I'm going to call this fog fade material. So now you can see it's in this folder, and we can come and open it anytime we want. And in fact, this is an easier way to edit it right now. We know that we're editing this material that we've created, and we want to add our custom shader here. So this step, we can create a new shader. And then there's a couple options. When we create a shader, by default, we would maybe write it in shader code, which is like a Godot uses, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like a GLSL style shader language, maybe with some variation. But what we want to use as a visual shader, this is going to be a lot easier as we get used to creating shaders in Godot. The mode, we'll set this to canvas item. Our 2D games are canvas item games. So these other types are, going to be used for different styles of shaders or different applications or different games. We've got particle, sky, fog, and spatial, which would be like our typical 3D game shader. So make sure that you have a visual shader and that the mode is set to canvas items. And then we can come down here and change the path. And what we want to save it to down here is going to be fog fade underscore shader. Oops, I don't want all caps. Like that. And then we can create. And there we go. So we've now got that resource here in this folder. And it's assigned already to our material because that's where we created it, right? So we've got those there. Now you can either click here to open it, or you could double click down here. And that's going to open our visual shader in this handy little shader panel here in Godot. And these visual shaders are kind of cool because it allows us to write a shader without knowing how to write code. Now, that being said, the nodes and things can take some time and adjustment to get to know and to learn how to use them. So this is by no means going to be an advanced shader tutorial. We're just going to do a very basic thing. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to take our existing fog shader, or fog texture, I'm going to say, and in fact, I'm going to modulate this back up so it's a lot brighter. What we want is we want this to fade from full opacity down to 0 opacity by the time it reaches the top. And so in order to do that, I'm going to zoom out so I can see the whole texture. And then down here, we're going to come into our fog fade shader. Make sure you're in the shader editor when you've opened that. And there's a couple things. This is actually really important because I was banging my head against the wall trying to figure out why I couldn't do what I was wanting to do. There's different parts of the shader that you can write to: vertex, fragment, or light. And what we want to do is fragment. Fragment is going to essentially affect the pixels of the shader. So we can come in here, make sure you've done that, switch to fragment. And this output is essentially what the shader is going to send out to the GPU, to the rendering engine. And everything that we add over here and plug into it is going to modify how things look. You'll notice that so far it hasn't changed how our material looks because we haven't added anything. We're still drawing this texture that we've got assigned to our Sprite 2D. Now here in this little shader panel, we can right click. That's a quick shortcut to be able to add a new shader node. So let's start by creating this gradient texture that we can use to fade. I'm going to type here in the search, I'm going to type texture. And then what we want is actually down here under functions, it says texture 2D. You'll know you've got it right if you're in the latest version because it should be orange like that. You have different options of types of textures that you want. We're going to just use the default and define our own texture. So I'm going to come down here And you guys are probably wondering why I use gradient texture 2D so much. They're just so dang handy. So this is the texture we want to use essentially to contribute to the transparency fade of this. I'm gonna go ahead and click this, and you can see that it opens the gradient over here in the inspector. So we have the same user interface that we're familiar with for editing this texture. I'm gonna go ahead and change this so that it has a pretty high resolution because I want it to be high def so it doesn't get bandy or anything like that. And I'm also going to drag the white down, and while holding Control or Command, pops that little grid on so you can snap it. You want these to be in a straight line top to bottom. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now let's go ahead and try this for a second. We can take this color output that we have on our texture and plug it into the color here. And you can see that it's adding the color to our texture, right? Black to white. Alternatively, what we really want is we want this to be on the alpha, which doesn't quite work right because it's not quite sure how to handle this. Here's what I would like to do. Let's go ahead and take our texture. I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to take this stop here, and I'm just going to drag the alpha all the way down. Now, what's kind of funny about this is you can see it does fully fade out, but we've got something weird happening where it's like the fog is becoming less intense as it fades out, like the noise pattern. And that's because we're technically overriding the alpha as we get closer to this top point of it, right? And so what we want to do is we want to combine the texture that we already have. We want to combine that alpha with this alpha that we're adding. So we can go like this. We can right click, add a node, and then we want an input node. And what this input node does is it lets us select one of these essentially texture channels that we want to grab and work with. And so we can grab the color. Where's color at the top? And if you click this little arrow here, it expands it. You can see we've got red, green, blue, and alpha. And this is going to be per pixel essentially, right? And so we want this alpha, and we want to combine it with this value here. Technically, we probably want to combine it with this alpha value right there. And so what we can do is we can right click again to add another new node. And there's different operators that we can use to do math to combine the numbers that come out of these, because obviously once we break this down to alpha values, they're just values between 0 and 1. So I'm just going to search for multiply. And you can see a lot of options popping up. But if you look down here, you should find a couple, actually there's several different operators. What we want under scalar is just this operators for multiply. And FLT for float. That's what we're working with. So this has two inputs for two different floats. And you can actually change the operator here, right? Add, subtract, divide, etc. We pop in our alpha to this B value. So it's A times B. And you can actually just use this. We could just multiply this by a value here. We could just type something in, right? Multiply that by 32 and then plop it into the alpha, which results in this little fade up here. But we actually want to take this alpha and plug it into the A. And because this is per pixel, now we get this cool effect where we're essentially combining the gradient and the noise texture. And now we get this pleasant fade. So this is all we're going to do with this shader. It's like I said, we're just going to make a really simple shader. And because we're not overriding the color, it's going to use the color that we've already kind of defined and configured on our Sprite 2D. You can use these visual shaders to do lots of cool stuff. And maybe in the future we'll do something fun with it. But that's all we're going to do there. So make sure you get this set up and working, and you can see how this has affected the texture. And now we're ready to kind of wrap up this fog. Okay, now that we've got this fog sprite shader material and everything set up, let's go ahead and change the modulate just a little bit, because now we've got a good fade. I kind of also want to change the size, and I'm going to show you here. If I change the height of this texture to 128 pixels or something, our fade's still going to work just fine right there. Obviously, now we've got to reposition it, but that's okay. We can just drag it down since we're only parallaxing it on the x-axis. And honestly, all the way down here, I think is good for this level. I don't really think I want it to be very big on this scene. It's sunny. The fog would have been burned off a little bit. We can turn this normalize on and off and get a sense for the different options. Maybe we want to recolor it a little bit. Maybe you want brighter or more faint or just more color, whatever you want to do. A little bit more color might not be bad. And now let's go ahead and just run this first scene now that we've set that up. So now we've got a little bit of extra fog on the bottom layer. Okay. Pretty simple and pretty straightforward, right? And on this scene, you know, maybe you want two of these. You could duplicate the fog layer, and now you've got a second one. You could come into this. You could change the noise a little bit. Maybe you want to take this and have a different frequency or a different seed. The seed is like the random seed, so you could keep the same settings, but it'll generate a different pattern. We could come in here and change the parallax scrolling scale to slightly larger. We could change other things like the auto scroll so that maybe it's only -10 on this layer, right? And by creating these multiple layers of texture, we're going to get something possibly a little bit more dynamic looking. It's kind of hard to see. You can kind of see it right here. It's kind of happening right there. The two layers are kind of blending to create almost an animated effect with that fog, okay? And honestly, for this particular scene, I'm going to drop down this. I want this to be a lot slower and a lot more gentle. And so I'm probably going to, now that I've got two layers, I'm even going to come and adjust this modulate on my fog as well. I don't want it to be quite so bright. So I'm going to drop this down to somewhere around 50, probably on both of these. Okay, give it one more run, one more quick test to make sure I'm fairly happy with the result. And there we go. A little bit of fog down there. It's animated. It gives just a little bit more life to the level. It's consistent with the colors that we've been working with throughout our scene, right? This particular screen is full of lots of greens and blues and cyans. So we're kind of sticking to that. And voila, ready to go. Now, as we come over to this next scene, we're going to just duplicate those nodes and apply them to this scene real quick. But we don't have to redo everything because we've already done most of the work, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to grab both of these parallax layers, copy them, go to level 2 scene. And this scene still needs organized. I'm not going to worry about it too much right now. I'm going to just go ahead and paste these in here. We've got our two fog parallax layers. Now these ones I want to be bigger. So I'm actually going to come in here to this fog sprite. And I am going to increase the height. Maybe 256 is what I want. I'm not sure. A little bit bigger, right? I'm going to do the same here. In fact, maybe this one... Oh, look, those are linked. Did I change the ones on scene 1? I hope not. Nope, good. Those stayed. So what happens, we've got this thing. When you've got these textures and things that you add directly to a node and then you duplicate them, then by default they're linked, which, is okay. I think technically some of the stuff I was doing in my last scene didn't take because we probably were editing both. We definitely were. Let's go ahead and do this. So just to correct that little mistake, I'm going to go here and make this unique. Now if I change the values on this one to, let's say I made this 512, it changed one and hopefully not the other. And then I could come in here and do what I intended to do before and change things like the frequency and keep them distinct and separate. Oh, why am I locked? What am I selected on here? I might need to make this unique as well. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and just drag this frequency to adjust it. Maybe we've got some really big stuff. And then down here, we've got some small stuff. Now on this scene, I'm also going to adjust the scroll repeat speeds. So I do want this one to be faster. I'm going to start with -15. And then down here, we'll go with something like -20. In fact, it would be fun. Let's just try it. Let's just see what it looks like. Let's give it a +10. Let's just see what this looks like. Now, let's see. I'm not seeing hardly anything. Is it there? Let's take a look at our settings here. What did we do with our fog? Do we need to make it stand out more? I guess I should have paid a little bit more attention, right? Let's drag the alpha up on this one. Okay. Yeah, that's there. It's there. Definitely working. Maybe this fog should be a little darker, though. I don't know. I really don't know exactly what I want to do on this one. Didn't think about it a whole lot ahead of time. Going to try and maintain similar color schemes, though, on these so that it feels harmonious and visually pleasing. So let's come down here to this modulate. And I think this one is smaller on the bottom. This is our smaller fog. It's kind of cool that having it dark, actually. I like that a little bit. I don't know. Make it orange, make it yellow. I'm going to make it a little bit greenish here. And just drag down. When you're working with colors, a little pro tip, if you make every color pick the most saturated version of the color, your game's just going to be totally it's going to be overkill, right? So you can take these colors and really decrease the intensity of them, and you'll get a much more pleasing effect. You really only want a few powerful colors in one composition, one scene, before it becomes overwhelming. Let's see how this looks. I've kind of adjusted those a little bit. I feel like I'm not seeing the movement though. What's going on with that? Did I mess that up? Let's take a look at our parallax layer. Auto scroll is on. Look how they're looking over here. Looks kind of nice. How about this one? Should we make it negative 30? Interesting. Why am I not seeing it? I am seeing the movement. I'm seeing it right here a little bit. I guess those opposite directions might be conflicting, or I'm not sure. Let's do that. Let's just make it white so that it can stand out. This one's just so big. I think it's, with that dark faded color, it's kind of blending in. I think we could come in here to our noise and maybe take this and adjust something. Let's see. What do we want to do? Maybe I want to take this, normalize, turn it on so that it's got more contrast. And then when I come down here, where's my modulate? Now I can modulate it again. And hopefully this means it'll look a little bit more obvious. There we go. Clearly this scene is a lot foggier, right? A lot more intense. Maybe a little bit too much actually, but I do like generally what I got going on here. You can see the other fog is moving this direction. I'm not sure I love that. Let's go ahead and set it to negative 15. I think I boosted this one up to 30. And then I'm going to modulate this fog one more time. Maybe make this one a little bit brighter because it's the one that's short and only on the bottom. So there you go. You can play around with the fog all you want, get a different effect. You know, make it fit what you like. While this is maybe a little bit heavy-handed here, it is kind of fun. It does give a really sense of a foggy scene. So you can decide how foggy you want it to be. I wouldn't go any heavier than this personally, I don't think, unless somehow it became part of the gameplay mechanics. I don't know. But there we go. Now that we've built this fog, though, let's move on to our beautiful torches, because we need to add some life to these. Now, one of the comments in my last video, I love it, you're reading my mind, was to add particles, and that's exactly what I planned to do. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Okay, here I am. I'm in my scene 3. I think this is a great scene to demonstrate what we're going to do with these torches. So I've got the torch scene selected. Let's go ahead and open it up. Obviously, with this scene, we've already got a point light, and we've got our animated sprite 2D, which is the root node. Let's go ahead and just add a particle. Ooh. And there are two types here. There's CPU particles 2D and GPU particles 2D. Obviously, there's 3D particles. I'm not going to use those for a 2D game. But we really want to use the GPU particles for the most part. If for some reason you were targeting devices that maybe didn't support these as well, you could. But generally, they should be more powerful, more performant on a modern computer. So let's go ahead and just go with that. And of course, we get our classic node configuration warning because we don't have a material to process the particles. So let's go ahead and open this up. And what it's looking for is this process material. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a new particle process material just like that. And it's now dripping particles. Excellent. Now, particles are another thing that can really be a lot to dive into, just like the visual shaders that we got into. Maybe particles are a little bit easier to digest, though, because you're going to get immediate, obvious feedback as you're playing around with these. But I'm going to go ahead and drag my particle up here to the flame, because this is where we want them to emit from. I don't know, somewhere around here. And obviously, we can turn on and off the particles. We can adjust how many particles we have. If we get a really high number, it's going to be kind of crazy. In reality, we're probably going to want fewer particles, but I'll leave it at 8 for right now. We've got a lot of good settings here that aren't even related to the process material. We've got time, which affect how long these particles exist in the world before they are disappeared. One that I will crank up is this randomness. I'm going to crank that all the way up to 1, which right now it's just maybe randomizing the timing a tiny bit. I'm not sure if it's really even doing that a whole lot. But we want a maximum amount of randomness because we're going to create sparks, and so they're going to be unpredictable. They just pop and whiz and fly around, right? But let's look at our process material now. I'm going to go ahead and collapse time, and we're just going to expand this process material. This has got lots and lots of settings. This is where it really can start to get overwhelming, because in addition to that stuff that we had up here, right now we've got all this extra junk. Let's look at our particle flags maybe. By default, it's disabled the Z because this is 2D. That's fine. We don't need to change that. Now, spawning refers to the particles as they're created, right? We want to make some changes in here. Now, one thing we can do is look at the position, and you can see that there's an emission shape offset and scale. And if we have a shape set, then that affects that. Right now, it's just set to point, which means it emits from right here. We could change this to something like a box, right? And then if we change the box size to something like 20 by 20, now you can see that they're spawning within that box. I'm actually not going to use that for this particular case because I think flying out from here is sufficient for what we need it to do. But obviously you can use that to control where they spawn. And so, if you had something long that they're falling from, you could just make a really wide, long rectangle with that box. Now, the next thing I want to look at that relates to the spawn, and we're going to ignore angle, but we're going to look at velocity. By default, they're just falling. There's no inherent velocity. We want them to generally have a velocity that shoots them up. I'm going to do a really small number. I'm going to do negative 0.3, I think. And then we're going to come down here. In order for this to work, we need to adjust some of these other settings. We're going to ignore velocity pivot. The direction is very important because we want it to go up again. So negative 16 maybe on the Y. And then let's come down here. This initial velocity is where the magic will start to happen. So right now the minimum and the maximum velocity is 0. If we were to drag this minimum velocity up to 95, you can see that they're shooting out with that velocity, right? Now, as I drug the minimum up, you can see that the maximum followed because obviously the maximum can't be lower than the minimum. But if we want to have variation, we can drag the maximum up. Now, some are going really fast and some are going slow. In fact, we could bring the minimum down to, something really low. Now we've got particles that are flying at totally different speeds, right? Which is actually pretty similar to what sparks do from a fireplace. You've got some that float out and then you've got some that pop and whiz out, stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and keep my minimum pretty low, maybe 20. And then the maximum, let's maybe put 300. So we'll keep it somewhat reasonable here. We're not going to go too crazy with it. Now, I'm not even sure actually if this inherent velocity matters. I think I was thinking something else when I said that. That's going to inherit velocity. I believe that it inherits maybe from the parent. Now, as we look at this, I'm going to set my X to 0 on this initial direction. And I might even increase this to negative 20. Now, these particles are just shooting out. They're not quite what we want, but they're getting closer, right? We need them to be a little bit more like woo and whiz around. And we can actually achieve that with this particle system pretty easily. But let's go ahead and just keep looking at some of these other velocity settings. So we're kind of good here with the spawn, but now we've got animated velocity. So this is different because this is the velocity kind of over time, whereas spawn is the initial velocity. What does it start with? And you can see that these are affected by gravity too, right? So let's expand angular velocity. Now you can see that this is going to give us velocity curve for what it says, right? Just the angle. So let's go ahead and give it a minimum and a maximum, and we can drag something. I'm going to probably type in here. I think the minimum is going to be like 200 and the maximum will be negative 200 and 200. And that's maybe not super evident really right now what's happening, but there's other things like directional velocity that we can play with, orbit velocity, radial velocity, and a velocity limit. But I guess really what I want to get into here is actually not the animated velocity so much, but this turbulence. This is where we can get that crazy effect that's going to look like a spark. So let's turn turbulence on. Oh boy. There we go. It hung for a little bit, didn't it? I was afraid it was going to crash. So we've got a noise strength and a noise scale, and I'm going to leave those alone. In fact, noise speed, leave that alone. Maybe it's this influence and the displacement that we want to adjust. And so if I look at this, I can increase the max a little bit. You can see how they're kind of like wobbling and doing weird stuff. Some of them are doing less because our minimum is pretty low. Some of them are doing a lot. If we crank this up to max on all of them, you can see how they're totally jittering everywhere. And if we had 0, then we've got some sparks that just shoot out in a straight line. I think we do want to keep a minimum. What was that minimum? 0.1? I think that felt really good actually. And then our maximum, you can play around with this, but I don't know, 0.3 maybe. I'm just kind of taking a shot in the dark there. But you can see we've got some fun sparks that are flying and whizzing. Some of them move fast, some of them wobble more. And because we're randomizing all these different factors, no two sparks are quite the same. There's also maybe an initial displacement. Let's go ahead and mess with this and see what it does. If we crank these, I'm not sure what that's doing actually. Let's just put these, I feel like it's adjusting how much of that influence they have initially. So I'm just going to do two opposing numbers, -20 and 20. Okay, honestly, I think that's pretty good so far for the sparks. Now, the last thing that we want to do after messing with the turbulence here maybe is to just come to this display. We kind of skipped over this, but this can affect how each particle looks, right? I mean, obviously up here we do have the option to assign a texture. For this pixel art game, this default little pixel is kind of perfect, I think. I don't really want to mess with a texture for this one. But let's come down here, and we want to use this color curves because we want the color to change, right? Because sparks start hot and then they fade out. So you guessed it, we're going to use another gradient map. So let's come down here to our color ramp, and we're going to select a new gradient texture, 1D, and just open this guy up. So the stop on the left is going to be the initial color. You can see they're starting black and then they're becoming white. We want to obviously swap that. Let's start with a pretty bright, almost white yellow color. And then I'm going to add a stop over here. I'm going to get more orange and saturated. And I may even want to put like a full yellow right over here. I don't know. Okay. And then as we fade out, we want to do what we did with our lights. We're going to pick this deep orangey color, and we're going to drop the alpha down as well. So you can see that they slowly fade out. Now, one last thing I want to do here. I really want to use this HDR. I don't have HDR turned on, so that's not going to do a whole lot, but we can come in here. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to set the intensity up to like +2 on this first one. And then I'm tempted actually just to simplify this and just remove that. And let's just make this mostly yellow because we've made it +2. It's going to appear quite white, I think. Maybe we need to increase that a little bit more to get that. Okay. 4. And let me actually go back in here. I want a little bit more orange. And then I'm going to just take this last one. We can keep the intensity high on this one, even though it's fading out. I'm going to set it to 2. Alpha is still 0. I'm just going to keep this somewhat more saturated, maybe. I'm not loving it. I'm not loving it. I want a little bit more color. I want more color coming out of there. Let's go ahead and one more stop. I'm doing it. I'm just going to put a stop in the middle. So this is probably good. Needs to be about 3 maybe. Oops, that's a 2, 3. Alpha in the middle, more orangey. Is that working? Sorry guys, I'm being so fickle with this. I'm going to come back in here. I just got rid of that middle stop. I'm going to just set this to +1 and take this last stop, leave it at, I'm going to set it to +1 as well. Full red. Ooh, I don't want blue in there. Don't want any blue. I think that's going to look pretty good. You can see that it is fading over time, right? Let's go ahead and just test this out. We've got this now applied to all of our torches, so you can see it happening here in the level, right? And I think one thing that might actually be fun to do is I wonder if we go back to this and to our material here. And let's go ahead and do a new shader, or not shader material, canvas item material. I just want to change one thing. I want to change the light mode to unshaded. So it shouldn't be affected by the lights in the scene. It's hardly noticeable, but there we go. We could change it to add too. See what it's doing there? Let's see how that looks over here. Well, that's kind of cool. Makes it a little bit brighter. I don't know if I love that, but let's go ahead and test this scene out now that we've made those changes. There we have it. Now our torches have some fun little sparks. So you can play around with those settings and tweak them to your heart's content. to get the sparks looking how you want. I think the one thing I'm feeling as I look at them right now is there's maybe too many sparks, right? A little bit too much going on. So the only thing that we need to do to tone that down is to just come up here. I mentioned we might adjust this amount. Probably something pretty low, like a 3. That way they're a little bit more sparse, not too crazy. There we go. I like how the particle systems emit in the editor. I think that's fun. I think that's good. Gives us a nice preview of what's going on. So there we have it. One set of particle systems done. Next, we're going to use particles to create a more ambient effect on our scene 1 level. Okay, I'm back. Level 1. This is where I want to add these floating and beautiful little orbs that we're going to add. And it's going to be a particle system as well. So let's just come in here and do a Control A. I'm already on the particles, so that's nice. And in here, we, of course, need to set up a process material. So we'll come in here and do that. Just new particle process material. For these, we do actually want to use a texture. So I'm going to create a new texture. We want, in this case, my favorite, gradient texture 2D. Flying out there. Nice little gradient. But we want this to be radial because we're going to make a nice glowing ball. And the size of this can be small, maybe 16 pixels. Doesn't need to be big. And let's see, actually, let's go back down here. I want the fill to be radial. And then let's go ahead and drag these guys to the center and straight to the top. And define our simple gradient that we're going to use. I'm going to start with a very greenish color, kind of like this. And actually, I want it to obviously be a little bit over here. I don't know, something like that. And then I'm going to drag the intensity or set it quite high, maybe 2. Next, I'm going to take this second stop here and I'm going to go to recent colors. I'm just going to select, is this that color? Yeah, that is right there. It looks white because of the intensity. I'm going to set the intensity to 0. So we've got this circle going, but also the alpha to 0. There we go. Little bit of a floating orb of color, a little light, like a little pixie floating around or a giant particle of dust wafting through the air. The next thing we want to look at is something we didn't look at previously. Oops, don't want to do that. I just want to collapse that. There we go. I want to come, well, let's go to the time. I want these to be alive for a little bit. I'm going to say 5 seconds. And we can give a randomness to this as well. I'm going to crank the randomness pretty high. So some of these are going to last longer than others. You can see they'll disappear at some point, right? I don't know. Are they just all falling behind that? They are. Can't even see them disappearing. So if we look at this randomness, it's the emission lifetime randomness. So I don't know. I'm just going to crank it high so that we get a little bit of randomness, or actually a lot of randomness, right? And then we're going to come down here to drawing. Now this is interesting because it's the visible rectangle. So you see how we've got this rectangle right here? We didn't really deal with this a whole lot. I'm going to go ahead and just drop this in here. Well, we'll leave it where it is actually, and we're going to demonstrate this. In order for this to work though, we want to configure how these particles are going to spawn. We want them to fill the whole level. And this visible rectangle is going to be something we have to adjust so that we can see them throughout the whole level, but we'll see that. We'll implement it a little bit first and show you what happens if we don't set that properly, and then we'll configure it. So let's go ahead and come in here. I want to do a similar thing. I'm going to just do a quick new material, right? A new canvas item material, just the same thing we did with those sparks, I guess. I want to set this to add. And then the light mode, they don't need to be light. I'll say unshaded. So now these are going to light the scene a little bit differently. And then let's configure the particles emission now. So let's see, where's that? Where's my process material? Let's look at the spawn settings, and this position is going to be pretty important on this one. We're going to set this to box, and we want this to be pretty big. We're going to use this emission shape scale maybe. We could use the box extents as well, I suppose. Let's see. One's going to scale it and one's going to make it bigger. Let's go ahead and set the emission box extents then maybe. I don't know. Let's set the X to like 600. You can see it's starting to create a box here, right? And so now our particles are falling from that box. And I want my particles to be able to spawn anywhere in this rectangle, not just from the top and dropping down. So I'm going to set the Y as well. And we'll set the Y to a size that roughly fits the height of our level, right? So I'm going to just say 200 maybe. Now if I drag this over so that it covers my level, right? You can see, and let's go ahead and set this. Boop. I guess it's behind these things. That's okay, but you can see we've got this box, and these particles are starting at the top of the box, and they're falling down. Some of them are starting in the middle. You can see one every now and then pop up, okay, because they have a random location by default. But there we go. We've defined an emission shape. You could also use the shape scale, whatever. Now let's look at this velocity. Maybe we want to give them a little bit of a random velocity as well, like we've done with the sparks. These are going to be more slow moving and floaty, but we still want randomness, of course, right? So I'm just going to come down here to the initial velocity. We're going to have some at 0, and then the max I'm going to set to like 300. Woo! You saw the one that just shoot off there. I'm going to set the direction to 0 as well. Let's see what this does here. I don't know if that did anything. Now, I also want to come down and maybe look at our accelerations. This gravity here, I don't want them to be falling as fast as they are. So I'm going to really reduce this to like 10. So now they are falling a little bit, but they're mostly unaffected by the gravity of the world, right? There's a little bit, but not much. Now let's configure maybe the shape items next. So under display here, I want to scale these a little bit. So some are going to be a little bit smaller, some are going to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to make a minimum scale of 0.75, and the maximum is not going to be too huge, 1.25. So now we can see they're slightly different sizes. Pretty simple. We want a color ramp again. Now this one's going to be different because we want them to fade in and out is what we want. So let's look at this texture here. And let's go ahead and just make a third stop. So we're going to have one that's white. Actually, we might need 4 stops. We might want to go in here and just add another one. And then just turn this one back down to black. So these should fade out. You see how they fade in and then out? So we don't have anything that pops in really harsh, but we have a nice fade in and out. The next thing we can configure in here is I do want a hue variation. Okay, so this is kind of a fun one. What this is going to do is it's going to shift the color, just like if you know hue and saturation adjustments in Photoshop or something like that. We're just adjusting the hue. We don't want to go too heavy-handed with this, otherwise we could get some really wildly different. In fact, let me just crank up the amount. I'm going to go like 500. Okay, you see all those crazy colors? I mean, that's not too terrible. This is a fantasy world after all, but I kind of really want this to be subtle. So just a low value gives you variation. You see that? And in fact, I might go a tiny bit lower, 0.05 maybe. Gonna go ahead and save that. Okay, that's looking as hectic as all get up. You could say I could use this to do some fun stuff, falling down or whatever. Now let's turn on turbulence for these as well. Please work with a whole bunch on like this. There it goes. So what we want to do with our turbulence, we're not going to adjust the noise strength or scale. It's already doing what we want it to, actually, right? You can see them doing their thing. But let's just adjust this a little bit. Under influence, you know, you've got the min and max. You can use these arrows instead of these down here to adjust it. Yeah, I'm going to set the influence max pretty low. Something like that. But now we've got that turbulence applied, so they're just kind of like floating randomly in random directions, right? Makes it kind of nice and organic feeling. Now, I think the only thing I really need to do is just decrease this. 50 is a good amount, I think. We don't want a ton, but we want it to spawn throughout the level. Let's go ahead and test this scene, though, and see what happens with these little floaty bits that we've got. Okay, that took a little bit to compile that shader, it seems like. Maybe too many, but whatever. We've got some little things floating in and out here. And actually, we didn't run into the issue that I thought we would with the visibility. So sometimes you can like leave the visible area of these particles, and then they just turn off. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to make this rectangle, or this box. It's a rectangle, right? We're going to make it really small, 10 by 10. And if I save this and run again, it should do what I was talking about. So right now you don't see. Oh, there we go. We've got a couple particles. Let's walk across. Let's see what happens. Yeah, there we go. You see how they just like suddenly disappeared? And then when I come over here, they're back on. Bonk, bonk, bonk. You got to be careful. If you ever notice that popping, it's just because this visible rectangle is like too far away from your camera for them to render. This is kind of a performance measure in a lot of ways, right? If obviously you don't want to be rendering physics particles that you aren't even showing. But in this case, with this level, we're just going to make it a bigger box. And to be safe, I'm actually going to increase the, let's see, the X, I'm going to make it like 500 and the height will be like 200. And then you can see we've also got an X and Y offset for this. So I should center it like negative 250. Should be good there. Now this is going to be pretty good size of rectangle. It should always be able to render these no matter where I go within this level. Okay. Now there we have it. That's kind of all I want to do with this scene with these particles and the little extra fog. So we've managed to go from some pretty simple levels with very little in them. And given it's been slow and I've taken the course of several videos to explain these concepts and some of these features, but I hope you guys like the outcome of how these levels look. I am going to do one more video in this chapter. In the next episode, we're going to talk about maybe just some general techniques and concepts and practices you can follow as you lay out and design your levels. And in addition, we're going to clean up a little bit. We're going to take the player and make it so that we don't have to drop them into every level within our Godot editor to be able to have them there. We're going to create a nice player spawn node that we can just drop into every level, and he'll spawn there if we need him to, but if he already exists, it'll just ignore him. Okay, so we'll do that. That's going to be really important, especially as we get into, you know, working with a larger game where you've maybe got dozens or even like 100 levels. You don't want to have to be dropping the player into all those. You just want to have a simple little node that you can have available and something that works seamlessly both in testing and in your game. So thanks for following along. I hope you guys learned something new in this video. If you are new to my channel and you want to see what I'm building, then please subscribe and give this video a like. And of course, comment if you've got questions or comments on the things I've done. Maybe you've got different ideas that you think would work really well for this or similar effects. So please go ahead and drop those. And as always, we'll see you next time.